It was 110 degrees the afternoon my neighbor tried to have me arrested on my own front porch. Not fined, not warned, arrested. I want you to picture this. You are standing in your driveway. The air is so hot it moves like water off the asphalt. A UPS driver has just set down a wooden crate, something you have been waiting on for over a year. And before the truck is even out of the cul-de-sac, you hear a voice from across the street. Calm, deliberate. And then the words she says into that phone land on you like a bucket of cold water. "Yes, dispatcher, I think I see a leak. It smells like sulfur. Please send someone before the neighborhood is contaminated." There was no leak. There was no sulfur. There was a wooden crate from Munich, Germany, sealed with steel strapping, sitting bone dry under an Arizona sun. I stood there and I looked at her, and she looked right back at me, and she was smiling. That smile is what I want to start with, because that smile told me everything I needed to know. Not about the crate, not about the police cruisers that pulled into my driveway 10 minutes later, about her. My name is Sam. I spent 32 years as a senior United States postal inspector. I have tracked international mail fraud across 4 countries. I have testified in federal court more times than I can count. I have seen every variation of theft, deception, and manipulation that involves a package, a label, and someone who thought they were clever enough to get away with it. I retired to Scottsdale, Arizona to restore antique grandfather clocks and donate them to veteran centers and children's hospitals. That is all I wanted. Quiet mornings, a workbench, a community I could grow old in. What I found instead was a neighborhood that had been slowly robbed for over a year by the one person every resident trusted most, the woman who sat at the front of every HOA meeting, brought banana bread to every community event, and drove a golf cart with a fake security light on top. She had stolen more than $50,000 in merchandise from 22 families, electronics, jewelry, designer goods, all of it redirected, intercepted, or simply lifted off porches by someone who had the access, the authority, and she believed the perfect cover. She was not worried about sulfur. She was not worried about hazmat. She called 911 that afternoon because that crate was too heavy to steal, and she needed the police to open it before I did, because somewhere in that delivery batch was a $2,000 laptop that belonged to my neighbor, a laptop she had tried to redirect to my address and could not take back. She needed me to look like the problem. She had been doing it for months, and until that afternoon, it had worked. Here is what this video is going to show you. It is going to show you exactly how someone uses a position of trust inside a homeowners association to run a theft operation that most victims never even recognize as a crime. It is going to show you the specific moment she miscalculated and why calling the federal government down to my driveway was the single worst decision she ever made. It is going to walk you through the 18 minutes it took me to find enough evidence to end her and what the body cam footage captured when she realized it was over. And at the end, I'm going to tell you 3 things you can do right now, today, to make sure someone like her never does this to your household. Because she is not unique. She is a type, and she's living in more neighborhoods than you think. Officer Miller was young, probably mid-20s. He walked up to me with that careful, professional expression they teach at the academy, and he said, "Sir, we have a report of a hazardous materials threat. I need you to step back while we assess." I looked at him. I looked at the crate. I looked at Deborah standing at the edge of my driveway with her clipboard pressed to her chest and that smile still on her face. And I said, "Officer, before you touch that box, give me 20 minutes, because you are not here about a package. You are standing in the middle of a crime scene, and the person who called you is the one you should be looking at." He gave me the 20 minutes. What happened next is why I'm still talking about this 3 years later. Stay with me. I have stood in front of federal judges. I have testified in cases involving millions of dollars in stolen mail. I have looked dangerous people in the eye without flinching. But nothing in 32 years of government work prepared me for the feeling of standing in my own driveway while a neighbor told a 911 dispatcher that my delivery was a chemical threat. That is where this story begins. Not with a courtroom, not with a badge, with a wooden crate and a woman who smiled like she had already won. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Scottsdale in July is not a place to stand outside any longer than you have to. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the pavement, that turns your car steering wheel into something you need a cloth to touch. I had been waiting for that delivery since the previous summer, a 19th century clock mechanism from a private collector in Munich, Germany. The piece was the centerpiece for a grandfather clock I was building for a new veterans residential home being opened just outside of Scottsdale. I restore antique grandfather clocks. I find them at estate sales, at auctions, sometimes in the back of barns where families have stored them for decades because nobody knows how to fix them anymore. I clean the gears by hand, I replace worn-out springs, I refinish the cases. And when the clock is running again, when you hear that first chime after sometimes 100 years of silence, I donate it. Veterans centers, children's hospitals, senior living facilities. That is what I do with my retirement. That is all I wanted to do. The UPS driver was a young man named Carlos who would become something of a regular at my address. He knew the crates, he knew how to secure them properly on the dolly. He set that German crate down on the concrete just inside my garage door. We shook hands the way we always did, and he was back in his truck within 4 minutes. I was still looking at the shipping label when I heard the voice. I want to be precise about this, because the details matter. I did not hear shouting. I did not hear alarm. What I heard was a voice that was controlled, rehearsed, the voice of someone who had already decided what they were going to say before they picked up the phone. It was coming from across the cul-de-sac, maybe 40 feet away. Yes, dispatcher, I have a concern about a delivery at my neighbor's address. There are warning labels on the side of the package that I cannot identify. I think I see a leak. There is a smell like sulfur coming from the crate. I am worried this could be a hazardous material situation. Please send someone before the neighborhood is affected. I stood very still. The crate was a sealed wooden shipping container, standard international freight packaging, with customs documentation on the outside and nothing else. There was no leak, there was no smell, there was no chemical warning of any kind. The afternoon air smelled like hot pavement and desert grass, the way it always does in July. I turned and looked at her. Deborah was standing at the edge of her driveway, cell phone pressed to her ear, clipboard tucked under her other arm. She was wearing a cream-colored linen shirt and slacks that were too neat for a Tuesday afternoon. She was looking directly at me, and she was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic smile. The smile of someone who believed, completely and without doubt, that she had just made a move that could not be countered. 2 Scottsdale PD cruisers arrived 11 minutes later. I know because I looked at my watch. Officer Miller, who could not have been more than 26 years old, walked up my driveway with the careful, measured step of someone trained to de-escalate before assessing. He told me there had been a report of a possible hazardous materials threat at my address and that I needed him to step back while they determined the nature of the contents. I nodded. I told him I understood. I told him the crate contained antique clock parts shipped from Germany through standard international freight channels, that all documentation was in order, and that I would be happy to provide the shipping manifest, the customs clearance forms, and the contact information for the shipper in Munich. He thanked me and asked me to give them a few minutes. I looked over at Deborah. She had moved slightly closer to the edge of her property. She was still holding the clipboard. She was still watching. The smile had settled into something quieter now, something more certain. She thought this was the moment she had been working toward for 6 months. She thought the police were going to open that crate, find something she could use against me, and finally have the justification to do what she had been trying to do since I moved into Coyote Run. What she did not know, standing there on that July afternoon in the heat, was that she had made two catastrophic mistakes. The first was calling the police at all. The second was smiling at me while she did it. I had spent 32 years learning how to read the behavior of people who were hiding something, and in the 30 seconds I spent looking at that smile, I understood something I had been too willing to ignore for months. Deborah was not afraid of what was in my crate. She was afraid of what was not in it. When someone goes out of their way to create chaos around you, the question worth asking is never what they claim to be worried about. The question is what they are trying to stop you from seeing. But to explain why that realization mattered as much as it did, I need to go back to before the crate, before the fines, before Deborah. I need to tell you who I was before I moved into Coyote Run, because that is the part of this story she never bothered to find out. People hear the words postal inspector, and they picture someone sorting envelopes. Let me tell you what it actually means, because it matters more to this story than anything else. Before I tell you what happened in that driveway, before I tell you what I found on my computer in the 18 minutes after those police cruisers arrived, you need to understand the lens I was looking through, because the lens changed everything. The United States Postal Inspection Service is one of the oldest federal law enforcement agencies in the country. We carry federal badges and federal credentials. We have arrest authority. We investigate crimes involving the mail, package delivery networks, wire fraud, and organized theft operations that cross state lines and, in many cases, international borders. I joined at 31 years old, after a decade working financial fraud investigations for a private firm. I spent the first 6 years in Phoenix, then was transferred to a regional operations unit that covered the western states. Over the course of my career, I worked cases that involved everything from individual mail theft, someone stealing checks out of mailboxes on a residential street, to coordinated networks that were intercepting tens of thousands of packages per year using fraudulent redirect orders and compromised delivery access codes. That last category is the one that is relevant here. What most people do not realize is that modern package delivery systems have built-in access tiers. Apartment building managers can receive packages on behalf of residents. Business account holders can set delivery preferences and alternate addresses. Homeowners associations in certain managed communities can be granted limited administrative access to coordinate deliveries for residents who travel frequently or request assistance. These systems exist to make life easier. They are built on the assumption that whoever holds the access credential is trustworthy. In my experience, that assumption fails more often than most people would be comfortable knowing. I had worked cases where property managers used their building access to intercept deliveries for weeks before anyone noticed. I had worked cases where a single individual with a legitimate-looking role inside a residential community diverted high-value packages, electronics, pharmaceuticals, financial documents over a period of months by making small adjustments that looked, on the surface, like routine clerical corrections. The signature of that kind of theft is specific. It does not look like a smash and grab. It does not set off alarms. It looks like a mistake, a misdelivery, a carrier error. The victim calls the shipper. The shipper opens a case. The case gets closed as unresolved. The thief moves on to the next one. I had spent 3 decades learning to see that pattern for what it was. I retired in the spring of the year I moved to Scottsdale. My wife had passed 2 years earlier, and I wanted a change of scenery, something smaller, warmer, quieter than the life I had lived. A colleague told me about Coyote Run. He said it was well maintained, safe, and that the residents mostly kept to themselves, in a polite way. He said there was a golf course nearby and a good hardware store 20 minutes down the highway. I was not looking for a community. I was looking for a workbench and enough space to park a pickup truck. I found my house on a Thursday, made an offer on a Friday, and closed 6 weeks later. I had no particular expectations. I was 63 years old, I had survived a career that had taken me through some genuinely ugly situations, and I had come out the other side with my health, my savings, and a workshop full of unfinished clocks. I thought the hard part was behind me. The skills you spend a lifetime building do not disappear when you stop getting paid for them. Sometimes the reason you developed them was never the job at all. Sometimes the reason was waiting for you in a neighborhood you moved to in retirement. I did not know any of that when I pulled into Coyote Run for the first time. All I knew was that the gravel was the right color and the garage was big enough for my tools. What I didn't know was that the community I was moving into had an architecture of rules, relationships, and access that was perfectly designed for someone with very specific intentions, someone who had already been there for years, waiting. The first document they handed me when I moved into Coyote Run was 114 pages long. That should have told me something. Looking back now, I understand that the rules themselves were never the problem. Rules in a shared community are reasonable things. What I did not see then, what most new residents do not see, is who those rules are designed to serve when the wrong person is in charge of enforcing them. Coyote Run is what the real estate industry calls a master-planned community. It was developed in the early 1990s, about 400 homes across a series of curving streets that all feed into one another. The architecture is consistent: low stucco walls, clay tile roofs, desert landscaping with saguaro cacti and oleander. It is the kind of neighborhood that photographs well and holds its property values because everyone is legally required to maintain a certain standard of appearance. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, what HOA communities call the CC&Rs, specified that exterior tile must be adobe red, gravel in visible areas of landscaping must be desert bone, vehicle parking in the driveway was permitted but vehicles could not remain on the street overnight, and trash and recycling containers must be returned from the curb no later than 8 in the evening on collection days. I am not reciting these from memory to complain about them. Some of them are perfectly sensible. I am reciting them because I want you to understand the texture of the environment, the degree to which every visible surface of your property, every daily routine that touched the exterior of your home, fell within the documented jurisdiction of the HOA. The association was governed by a 5-member elected board. Board members served 2-year terms and were voted in at an annual meeting that realistically only about 30 or 40 residents ever attended. Below the board were several volunteer committee positions: Landscape Committee, Social Events Committee, Architectural Review Committee, and the Safety and Security Committee, which at the time I arrived had exactly 1 member. I did not attend my first HOA meeting until I'd been in the neighborhood for about 3 weeks. I went because I received a mailed notice saying that new residents were encouraged to introduce themselves, and because I am fundamentally the kind of person who reads his mail and follows through on things. The meeting was held in the community room of the main clubhouse. There were perhaps 35 people in attendance. The board chair, a retired dentist named Gerald, ran through the agenda items with the mild efficiency of someone who had done this many times: landscaping contract renewal, discussion of the guest parking policy near the pool area, a reminder about holiday decoration guidelines and the window of dates for which they were permitted. And then Deborah gave her safety and security report. She stood at the front of the room with a presentation printed on a half-dozen pages she had brought in a manila folder. She talked about package delivery trends in the neighborhood. She talked about a porch theft incident on Mesquite Loop 2 months earlier and the steps she had taken to coordinate with the delivery companies. She had, she explained, established a working relationship with the local UPS and FedEx route managers and had requested that the HOA be granted limited administrative notification access for deliveries in the community, so that in the event a package was misdelivered or a resident was traveling, the HOA could assist in coordinating. The board approved the request without significant discussion. Gerald thanked her for her diligence. A few people in the audience nodded. I sat in the back row and wrote nothing down because nothing struck me as unusual. She seemed like an organized person doing a volunteer job with more thoroughness than it probably required. That was my first and most consequential misreading of the situation. After the meeting, she came over and introduced herself. She shook my hand with both of hers, asked my name, asked where I had moved from, asked what I did before retiring. I told her I had worked for the federal government in mail and shipping oversight, which is the way I often described the job when I did not feel like explaining the full scope of it. Her expression did not change, but she held on to the handshake for just a moment longer than necessary, and something behind her eyes went still in a way that I noticed but did not assign meaning to until much later. "Well, welcome to Coyote Run. We take care of each other here." She smiled and moved on to the next conversation. I drove home and went back to my workbench. Power inside a homeowners association does not come from law. It comes from access to systems, access to information, and access to the time and willingness to show up when everyone else stays home. Whoever controls those three things controls a great deal more than most residents ever realize. I did not think about Deborah again for several weeks. The deliveries continued, the clock parts arrived as scheduled, my workshop began to take shape. And then one morning in October, she knocked on my door, and the version of Coyote Run that I thought I had moved into started showing its real face. She did not come to the door angry. That is the part I keep coming back to. She came smiling, and that was worse. I had been in the house for about 2 months when it started. In retrospect, I understand that she had been watching the deliveries for the entire time I had been there. I just had not given her reason to act yet. It was a Saturday morning in mid-October, cool enough that I had the garage door up while I worked, which I enjoyed. The morning light came in at a good angle, and I could hear the birds in the mesquite trees along the back wall. I was cleaning a set of brass movement plates from a late Victorian mantel clock, the kind of detail work that requires full attention and good light. I heard footsteps on the driveway before I heard the knock on the doorframe. Deborah was standing at the edge of the garage in a pressed blouse, clipboard in hand, with the expression of someone who had prepared for this conversation in advance. She looked at the workbench, at the parts laid out on the cloth, at the wooden crate propped against the wall that I had not yet broken down for recycling. "Good morning, Sam. Do you have a minute?" I set down the cleaning cloth and gave her my attention. She explained, in a tone that was professionally warm and utterly immovable, that she had been reviewing delivery activity in the neighborhood as part of her safety and security function, and that she had noticed I was receiving a higher than average volume of crated freight shipments. She said that the CC&Rs included a section 9.4, that addressed home-based business operations. She said she wanted to make sure I was aware that using a residential address for commercial receiving activity was a potential violation. I told her what I told anyone who asked. I was retired, I restored antique grandfather clocks as a personal interest, and donated the finished pieces to nonprofit organizations, veteran centers, children's hospitals, senior care facilities. I was not selling anything, I was not operating a business. The deliveries were personal hobby materials. She listened to all of this with her head tilted slightly, the way someone does when they have already decided their response and are simply waiting for you to finish speaking. "Activity is activity, Sam," she said. "This isn't a warehouse district, it's a sanctuary. Every large crate that arrives in this cul-de-sac changes the character of the space for all of us." I looked at her for a moment. "Deborah," I said, "I've read the CC&Rs. Section 9.4 applies to commercial operations that generate customer traffic, signage, or storage visible from the street. I have none of those things. I have a workshop inside a closed garage." She smiled. "I'll look into it further and be in touch." She left. I stood in the garage for a while after she was gone, thinking about the conversation. Not about what she had said, but about the way she had looked at the crate against the wall. It was a specific kind of attention, not curious, Inventorying. At the time, I thought I was reading too much into it. I was a retired investigator who had spent 30 decades looking for patterns in behavior, and I was aware that that tendency could misfire in ordinary social situations. I told myself she was probably just a person who genuinely cared too much about neighborhood aesthetics and needed to feel useful. I went back to the movement plates and finished what I was doing. 3 weeks later, the first letter arrived from the HOA. It cited Section 9.4 and imposed a fine of $250 for what it described as sustained commercial delivery activity inconsistent with residential community standards. I paid it, not because I agreed, but because the amount was low enough that contesting it through the HOA's formal review process would have taken more time and energy than it was worth. That was the second time I did something I later regretted. A person who smiles while telling you that you are wrong is not trying to resolve a misunderstanding. They are testing how much you are willing to absorb before you push back. The smile is not warmth, it's calibration. Paying that fine taught her something about me. I understand that now. It told her that I was the kind of person who would choose peace over confrontation, who would absorb a small loss to avoid a larger disruption. And once she knew that, the next move was already decided. The second fine arrived 41 days after the first. By the third, I had stopped being surprised and started paying attention. There is a difference between a neighbor who is difficult and a neighbor who is deliberate. I had dealt with difficult people my entire career. What I was beginning to recognize in Deborah was something else, a consistency, a rhythm that felt less like grievance and more like strategy. The second fine was $500. The citation listed excessive cardboard waste visible from the public right-of-way. On the day in question, I had broken down 4 shipping boxes from a parts delivery, stacked them flat beside my recycling bin, and placed a piece of strap across them so they would not blow around in the wind. They were at the edge of my property, set out the morning of collection day, and gone by noon. I have neighbors in my previous city who did the same thing every other week for 20 years without incident. I paid the fine. The third fine arrived because a delivery driver set a box on the public sidewalk for approximately 90 seconds while he went back to the truck for a second item. Someone photographed it. The citation referenced obstruction of pedestrian right-of-way and assessed $250. I stopped paying and started documenting. Around this same time, I began to notice that my deliveries were being disrupted in ways that were harder to trace back to a formal citation. A pendulum assembly I had ordered from a horological supplier in Bern arrived 3 weeks late because the initial delivery attempt had been marked as a failed delivery. Driver noted address unconfirmed. I called the shipper, who called UPS, who reviewed the route log and found no notation of any problem at my address for that date. The shipment had been held and rerouted before reaching me. This happened twice more over the following 2 months. A set of suspension springs from a restorer in Pennsylvania returned to sender after 2 delivery attempts, the driver having purportedly been told the address was under dispute. A small crate of clock hands and dial faces, held at the regional facility for 11 days before I called to ask why, and was told the delivery address had been flagged for administrative review by a community coordinator. I did not know what a community coordinator was in the context of UPS's residential delivery system. I found out that it was a designation available to certain managed residential communities, homeowners associations that had registered for a coordination access tier to help with deliveries in the neighborhood. I wrote that down and let it sit. By this point, Deborah had added a new element to her routine. She had begun positioning herself near the street during the morning delivery window, not blocking traffic, not doing anything that could be easily reported, just being present, standing near her mailbox with the clipboard, walking slowly along the sidewalk on the opposite side of the cul-de-sac, making eye contact with delivery drivers as they pulled up. A driver named Marcus, who ran the late afternoon UPS route, told me one day when he dropped off a package that the woman across the street had told him on his previous visit that the resident at my address was under investigation and that he should confirm with her before leaving anything large. He said he had not done so because he had no procedure for that and the delivery was properly addressed, but that it had made him uncomfortable. I thanked Marcus. I asked him if he would be willing to note the conversation in his own delivery log if I needed later. He said he would. I added his name to a document I had started keeping on my computer. Harassment that uses official-looking procedures and small incremental actions is designed to exhaust you, to make the cost of fighting back feel higher than the cost of giving in. Most people give in. That is what it is built for. I was not most people, but I also had not yet understood the full scope of what was happening, not just to me, but to every household in Coyote Run. That understanding came slowly, the way the worst realizations always do, built from small details that only make sense when you finally put them side by side. I had been waiting 12 months for that crate. Deborah had been waiting for it too, just for a very different reason. Everything I have described up to this point, the fines, the disrupted deliveries, the pattern I was beginning to see, all of it had been building toward a single moment. I did not know that on the morning the crate arrived, but I know it now. The shipment originated from a private collector in Munich who had acquired a mid-19th century Viennese regulator movement at an estate auction. He had reached out to me through a horological society forum where I had posted about restoration projects, and after several months of correspondence, we had arranged a purchase and international shipment. The movement was the mechanical heart of a large floor clock, the component that drives the timekeeping, the pendulum regulation, the chime sequence, and it was irreplaceable. You cannot buy a 19th century Austrian clock movement new. You find one or you do not. The crate weighed 83 pounds. It was built from pine boards with steel corner strapping, standard construction for heavy international freight. On the outside were the customs documentation, the shipper's label, the standard international freight markings, and nothing else. No chemical warnings, no hazardous materials designation of any kind. Carlos arrived at 12:40 in the afternoon. I helped him position the crate inside the garage on a furniture dolly I had ready. We shook hands, he left. I was reading the customs documentation when I heard the phone being dialed across the cul-de-sac. Deborah's voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone making a routine call, measured, concerned but not panicked. She had, I would come to understand, rehearsed the general shape of what she intended to say. Yes, dispatcher, I need to report a concern about a delivery at my neighbor's property. There are warning markings on the outside of the container that I am not able to identify. I believe there may be a leak of some kind. I can detect an odor coming from the package. It is possible this is a hazardous materials situation, and I did not want to wait. I set down the customs paperwork and looked across the cul-de-sac. She was standing in her driveway with her phone held to her ear. She was looking directly at me, and in the second that our eyes met before she looked away, I saw the expression I had been trying to name for 6 months. It was not anger. It was not anxiety. It was the expression of someone executing a plan they had complete confidence in. 11 minutes later, 2 Scottsdale Police Department cruisers pulled into my driveway. Officer Miller was polite. He explained the nature of the call. He asked me to step back from the crate. I told him I was happy to cooperate fully and that I could provide every piece of documentation for the shipment if it would be helpful. He thanked me and asked me to give them a few minutes to assess. I looked over at Deborah, who had moved to the edge of the sidewalk in front of her house. She was holding the clipboard flat across her forearms, watching the driveway with the focused attention of someone watching the conclusion of something they had set in motion. I stood there in my driveway in 110 degrees and I let myself think. She could not have believed there was actually sulfur in the crate. She had watched enough of my deliveries over the past 6 months to know what I received and why. She had intercepted enough communications with delivery drivers to understand the nature of the shipments. She knew what I was doing with these parts. So what did she actually need from this phone call? She needed delay. She needed the police to establish a reason to examine the contents of the crate before I opened it myself. She needed that to happen quickly, before I was alone with the shipment long enough to see what I was looking at.
I thought about the UPS notification I had received the previous Thursday, a redirect order that had been placed through the HOA's administrative access, attempting to reroute a delivery intended for my neighbor Wallace, a $2,000 laptop, to my address instead. The redirect had failed partway through processing because the shipper had flagged it as inconsistent with the original order, and the package had been held. But for approximately 18 hours, that order had existed in the system. My address, her login, a laptop that would now be arriving inside a delivery batch associated with my account. I went inside and sat down at my desk. When someone manufactures a crisis around you, the fastest path to understanding why is to ask what they needed to happen before you did. The answer is usually sitting right in front of you. You just have to be still enough to see it. I had 18 minutes before Officer Miller was going to come back to the door and ask for my documentation. 18 minutes is not a long time, but it was long enough because I knew exactly where to look and exactly what I was looking for. They teach you in the first year on the job that thieves always leave a pattern. Not because they are careless, but because the pattern is built into the method itself. You cannot steal systematically without being systematic about it. I sat down at my desk the way I had sat down at a desk 10,000 times before, not with urgency, but with focus. Urgency makes you move fast. Focus makes you see clearly. I needed to see clearly. The first thing I pulled up was the HOA's internal resident portal. Every homeowner in Coyote Run had access to a read-only version of the community records, meeting minutes, violation notices, maintenance schedules, and the incident and complaint log maintained by the Safety and Security Committee. Deborah filed her own reports into that log. I had read several of them over the past few months and found them detailed, precise, and I had noted at the time, unusually focused on delivery activity rather than the security concerns the committee was nominally responsible for. I searched the log for package-related incidents going back 14 months. 22 separate entries involving lost, misdelivered, or unaccounted for packages reported by Coyote Run residents. 22 households, 22 incidents, spread across 14 months. The names described in the incident reports were not random. Electronics, a piece of jewelry described as a gold bracelet ordered as a birthday gift, designer handbags, a high-end kitchen appliance, a laptop, a tablet, a smartwatch. All of them in the category that resellers refer to as high-turn, high-value merchandise, things that are easy to list, easy to ship, and easy to sell to buyers who ask few questions. In every single entry, the name Deborah appeared, sometimes as the person who had reported the incident on behalf of the affected resident, sometimes as the person who had assisted the delivery driver in attempting to locate the correct recipient, sometimes simply as the safety and security contact who had been notified and followed up. 22 incidents, her name every time. I moved to the second part of the search. I had access to a commercial investigative database that I had maintained a subscription to since my retirement, the kind used by licensed investigators and certain federal agency contractors for background research and pattern analysis. I used it occasionally for legitimate purposes, the way a retired doctor might keep a medical reference subscription. I queried it now for reseller account activity associated with Scottsdale, Arizona, in the category of consumer electronics and luxury goods, cross-referenced against new seller accounts opened in the past 16 months. 12 results came back. I filtered by transaction volume and account age. One stood out. The account name was Desert Queen 88. The location listed was Scottsdale. The account had been active for 14 months and had completed 74 transactions. The feedback rating was high.
The listings included laptops, tablets, wireless audio equipment, leather handbags, a set of designer sunglasses, a smartwatch, and several other items, all described as new, in original packaging, sold at prices that were below retail but above the kind of discount you would see for returned merchandise. I cross-referenced the item descriptions against the incident reports from the HOA log. 12 of the 22 lost package incidents had descriptions that matched, with reasonable specificity, items listed by Desert Queen 88 during the same general time period. That was not proof, I knew that. Description matches are circumstantial, but I was not building a case for a courtroom at that moment. I was building a direction. I opened the product listing photos. Most of them were taken against a white surface, unremarkable. But one, a listing for a brown leather tote bag, had been photographed on a patio table, and in the lower left corner of the image, slightly out of focus but visible, was a reflection in a decorative mirror propped against the exterior wall. Adobe red tile, desert bone gravel. The specific colors mandated by the Coyote Run CC and Rs for all exterior visible surfaces. I looked at the timestamp on the photo. I looked at the product description. I looked at the incident report from the HOA log that described a brown leather handbag reported missing from a delivery intended for a resident on Cigarro Circle. I saved everything to a folder on my desktop. I compiled the UPS redirect notice from the previous Thursday. I pulled up the HOA administrative access log, which listed the credentials used for any change request submitted through the community coordinator portal. Her name, her login, her timestamp. 16 minutes had passed. I picked up my tablet, stood up from the desk, and walked back outside. Evidence does not usually announce itself. It hides inside the details that people assume nobody will bother to look at. The background of a photograph, the timestamp on an access log, the name that appears once too many times in a record that was never meant to be read carefully. The difference between seeing it and missing it is simply the willingness to look. Officer Miller was standing near the crate when I came back through the garage door. He turned when he heard my footsteps. I told him I had something he needed to see before he opened anything, and the look on Deborah's face from 40 feet away when she saw me walking toward him with the tablet in my hand. That look told me that whatever she had planned, she had not planned for this. I have seen a lot of people realize that it is over. There is a specific shift in a person's face when the story they have been telling themselves about who they are, about what they have gotten away with, collapses all at once. I recognized it the moment I saw it. I walked back out into that driveway the same way I had walked into rooms for 32 years, without hurry, without theater, without any intention of performing something. I had the documentation. The documentation was going to do the work. Officer Miller was a young man doing his job professionally and without pretense. He had asked the preliminary questions, documented what needed to be documented, and was preparing to ask me for the shipping manifest and customs paperwork. He was not hostile. He was simply doing what the call required. I handed him the tablet and walked him through it methodically. First, the HOA incident log, 22 entries, 14 months, the item categories, the description of Deborah's role in each case. Second, the Desert Queen 88 account, the transaction history, the overlapping item descriptions, the photograph with the Adobe red tile and desert bone gravel reflected in the background mirror. Third, the UPS administrative access log, the redirect order placed the previous Thursday using the HOA community coordinator credentials, the attempted rerouting of a laptop belonging to a resident named Wallace to my address, the timestamp, the credential identifier which was assigned specifically to the Safety and Security Committee account, managed by Deborah. Fourth, a written statement I had quickly drafted from my conversation with the UPS driver Marcus, noting that he had been approached by a resident across the street who had told him the address was under investigation. Miller read through the materials carefully. He asked me to go back through the redirect notice and explain precisely what it documented, which I did. Then he turned toward Deborah. She had moved to the very edge of the sidewalk by this point, close enough to hear the general shape of the conversation, but not close enough to see the tablet screen. She was still holding the clipboard. She had recalibrated her expression into something that suggested helpful concern, the posture of a community volunteer present to assist. "Ma'am," Miller said, "can you tell me whether you currently hold administrative login credentials for the neighborhood's UPS Access Coordination account?" There was a pause. That's a neighborhood resource," she said. "I manage it as part of my safety committee responsibilities. It's all documented through the board." "And were you the person who placed a delivery redirect order last Thursday on a shipment addressed to a resident named Wallace?" Another pause, shorter this time, but different in quality. The kind of pause that is not thinking, but recalculating. "I was auditing the delivery logs," she said. "I was correcting an error." "The resident Wallace never requested a redirect?" "I was acting in the community's interest." Miller looked back at the tablet. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at Deborah. He reached toward his radio with one hand. What happened next is the part that no one who was present that day has ever quite been able to explain in ordinary terms. Deborah turned and walked away from the sidewalk at a pace that was not quite a walk. Then, within a few steps, it became something faster. She was moving toward her front door with a speed that made clear she had made a decision about where she needed to be, and quickly. Officer Miller, to his credit, did not need to deliberate. He called her name once, firmly and clearly. She did not stop. He covered the distance between them in a few seconds. She did not make it to her door. The body cam recorded the entire sequence. A woman in a cream linen shirt and pressed slacks on a hot Tuesday afternoon in a quiet Arizona cul-de-sac on the desert bone gravel of her own front walkway, while a second officer read her rights. I stood in my driveway and watched it happen. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in the way you feel after something that has been coming for a long time finally arrives. Running is a confession. Not a legal one, but a human one. At the moment a person chooses flight over explanation, they have already told you everything you needed to know. What the body cam captured that afternoon was only the beginning, because what investigators found inside Deborah's house over the following 2 days was something that went far beyond what I had been able to piece together from an HOA incident log and a reseller account. It was the full picture, and it was worse than any of us had imagined. When the detective called me the morning after the search warrant was executed, he said 4 words before anything else. "You were right, Sam." I had heard those words before, at the end of cases, and they never felt entirely like good news. There is a difference between suspecting something and having it confirmed. Suspicion carries hope that you might be wrong. Confirmation carries no such thing. What investigators found in Deborah's house removed any remaining possibility that this had been a misunderstanding, a gray area, or a person who had simply made poor decisions in a moment of temptation. The search warrant was issued and executed within 24 hours of Deborah's arrest. The team included Scottsdale PD detectives and 2 agents from the Postal Inspection Service, colleagues I had worked alongside during my career, brought in because the redirect orders and administrative credential misuse placed the investigation firmly within federal jurisdiction. What they found in the garage occupied most of a morning to document and catalog. $53,000 in merchandise, approximate retail value. Laptops, tablets, a high-end camera system still in its original box, 3 designer handbags with tags attached, wireless audio equipment, a set of cookware from a professional kitchen brand, 2 smartwatches, clothing still folded, A gold bracelet in a jewelry pouch that matched the description in an HOA incident report filed 14 months earlier by a resident named Carla, who had assumed the shipping company had lost her mother's birthday gift. All of it organized by category in labeled plastic bins on the garage shelving, with a notebook nearby that appeared to track listing prices and platform status, items marked as listed, sold, or held. The evidence connected to 22 households, 22 families who had been told their packages were lost, misdelivered, or caught up in some shipping error, and who had spent time filing claims and waiting on reimbursements that in many cases had never fully materialized. Mr. Wallace, the neighbor whose laptop had been the subject of the failed redirect order, came to my door 2 days after the arrest. He was a quiet man, a retired school teacher who had lived in Coyote Run for 11 years. He told me he had lost 3 packages in the past year, that he had attributed to what he called the usual shipping chaos. He had not connected them to a single source. He had not suspected a person. He stood in my doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I used to bring her Christmas cards. I did not have a response that felt adequate to that." Deborah was charged with felony theft under Arizona statute, wire fraud, and, through the Postal Inspection Service, federal charges under 18 U.S. Code Section 1708 for mail tampering and obstruction of mail. The federal charges mattered because federal sentencing is substantially different from state sentencing. Less discretion, fewer paths to early reduction. The prosecutor handling the federal component was a woman I had worked with on a case 9 years earlier. She told me the evidence was as clean as she had seen in this category of case. Deborah accepted a plea agreement. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal custody. The HOA board faced a civil action filed collectively by a group of affected residents, centered on the board's failure to implement any oversight of the administrative credential access it had granted to the Safety and Security Committee. The settlement required the board to dissolve the Safety and Security Committee structure entirely, implement written access protocols for any future community coordinator designations, and distribute a financial payment to affected households. The $1,500 in fines I had paid was returned to me as part of a separate civil settlement at 3 times the original amount. The HOA board chair, Gerald, sent me a handwritten note. He said he was sorry. He said he had not known. I believed him. Most people do not know because most people are not looking. That is not a moral failing. It is simply the ordinary condition of living in proximity to someone you have no reason to suspect. The damage that a person in a trusted position can do is not proportional to the power of their title. It is proportional to how long they go unquestioned. Trust without any structure of accountability is not a community value. It is a vulnerability. Coyote Run was quieter after that. Different. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from a community that had been shaken hard enough to need time to settle. I went back to my workbench. I went back to the German clock mechanism that had started all of this. And over the following weeks, as I worked on it, I thought about the 3 things I wished every person watching this already knew, because knowing them might have shortened everything I just described by most of a year. That clock stands in the lobby of the Scottsdale Veterans Center now. It chimes every hour. And every time someone tells me they have heard it, I think about the Tuesday afternoon when it almost never made it out of a crate. I want to end this the way I wish more people had ended their conversations with me over the years, not with a verdict, but with something you can use. Because Deborah is not a story about one unusual person in one unusual neighborhood. She is a profile, and the profile shows up everywhere. I finished the German regulator movement over the course of about 3 months. It is painstaking work with a mechanism that old. Every gear has to be examined individually, every bearing surface checked for wear, every spring tested for tension. There is no shortcut and no substitute for time. When the movement was running correctly and consistently, I built the case around it from walnut, fitted the dial, and adjusted the pendulum length until the beat was exactly right. The clock stands a little over 6 feet tall. The case is dark walnut with a beveled glass front panel. The dial is cream with black numerals, the way those movements were originally fitted. It chimes on the hour with a tone that carries well in a large room. The Veterans Center held a small dedication ceremony when I brought it in. There were about 20 people present: staff, a few residents, a board member. A man named Earl, who was 81 years old and had served in Vietnam, said it was the first working grandfather clock he had been near since his mother's house. He stood next to it for a while after the ceremony, one hand resting on the case, and did not say anything. That is what all of it was for. Now, I want to talk to you directly for a moment, because I think this story is only useful if you take something from it. The first thing I want you to know is about your rights in an HOA. A safety and security committee chair, a neighborhood watch captain, a community coordinator. None of these designations carry any law enforcement authority. They cannot legally detain you. They cannot compel you to open your packages or your property for inspection. They cannot redirect your mail or your deliveries without your explicit consent. If someone in one of these roles is telling you otherwise, that is not community standards. That is overreach, and in many cases, it is illegal. Read your CC&Rs carefully. Request the full documentation of any administrative access your HOA has granted to third parties or individual committee members. You have the right to that information. The second thing I want you to know is about what I now call the insider porch pirate. This is not the person who follows a delivery truck and grabs packages off stoops. This is the person who has access, formal, documented, legitimate-looking access to the systems that manage your deliveries. They know your schedule. They know what you order. They know when you are home and when you are not. The signs to watch for are specific. A neighbor who asks detailed questions about what you are expecting to receive. A person who repeatedly volunteers to help with your deliveries when you have not asked. Someone who seems to know about your shipments before you have mentioned them to anyone. These are not curiosity, they are operational awareness. The third thing is simpler, and I have believed it since the first year of my career. If someone is using a formal system, a committee, a board, a set of rules to make your life increasingly difficult, the question worth asking is not whether you have technically violated something. The question is what they needed to happen before you started looking closely. The answer to that question is almost always the answer to everything else. I live quietly in Coyote Run. The cul-de-sac is calm. My neighbors and I wave from driveways and occasionally share tomatoes from our gardens in the summer. The HOA meets quarterly now with a new board and a written access policy that 2 attorneys reviewed before it was adopted. Mr. Wallace got a new laptop. Carla never did recover her mother's bracelet, but she told me at a neighborhood gathering last spring that she had found another one similar at an antique market and that her mother loved it just as much. I have a new delivery coming next month, a pair of carved wooden finials from an estate in Connecticut for the top of a mission-style case clock I am building for a children's hospital in Phoenix. Carlos will bring it in on his dolly. We will shake hands. I will take it into the workshop, and it will be a perfectly ordinary afternoon. A home is not valuable because of its CC&Rs, or its desert bone gravel, or its adobe red tile. It is valuable because of the life you are allowed to build inside it, quietly, on your own terms. Protect that, know your rights, and pay attention to the people who need you not to. In Arizona, they say the desert hides a lot of secrets, but they also say you should not mess with the mail, because the post office always delivers, and so does karma.